I'm going to tell you 3 stories. One of them is about a forest. One of them is about a woman who saved thousands of children's lives. And this one is about here, now. You see this woman, she had a husband who had died. She had 7 children. She had to look after these children. It was difficult. Every day she would build a fire in their home. It was called a yuranga. Some people might call it a yurt or chum. It was built on ice. In the summer it was so hot, but in the winter the fire would keep everybody alive. And like you, sitting around in this circle, the children and the mother would do the same, with their feet facing the fire. When the children would wake up in the morning, over the spit would be fish, breakfast. And then they would be dressed by their mother, and they would go outside. And in the winter they would have heavy coats and boots and gloves, and they would go down to the lake and break the ice or skate. Sometimes they would go up into the forest, climb the trees, shake the snow from it. Sometimes the snow would be so deep you would disappear in it. Sometimes it would be so cold that when you breathed out, your breath would freeze on your skin. And sometimes, bless you, sometimes the mother was so tired because of the 7 and her that she would say to them, please, can you do something for me today? Can you build a fire? Can you dry the skins? But they would always have an excuse. There would always be a reason why they didn't help. Until one morning, when they woke up, their yuranga, their home, was freezing cold as outside. And as they began to sit up in their beds and look at one another, they said, why is the fire out? Where's Mother? Where's our breakfast? And they looked around and they saw the unusual sight of her lying in her bed still. And as they crept out of their own beds towards her, she had her hand around her throat. Here is the fire, she said. Here is the fire. I need water. Please, help me. And she reached underneath her bed where she kept her stick. And she took out a copper cup. And she gave it to them. And she said, go down to the lake. Bring me some water. Be careful. So they had to dress themselves for the first time, it seemed. And once they were fully clothed and had their big boots on their coats, they got to the door, which was an animal skin, and they undid the gut. It had been snowing all night long. There wasn't a footprint or a hoof print or a paw print anywhere. And as they were about to go out, she said, do not be long. Be careful. Oh, if only they had been. As they went outside, they could see the icy lake. Either side of it, huge forest covered in snow. And as they were walking, carrying the copper cup, suddenly, from the right, came a beautiful white hare. Look at him go, they said. And they began to chase him, running after him, running and running and running, until the hare disappeared in a forest. Where did the hare go? I don't know. Hey, look, it's a deer, let's chase the deer instead. And the deer went bounding between the trees, this way and that way. And they were chasing, now they were really running fast. And as they were running, they went down this hill, covered in snow, falling, and suddenly they said, well, where did the deer go? Hey, look, it's a polar bear, let's chase the polar bear instead. And they chased the polar bear, and the polar bear and went straight out of the forest up into the mountain, leaping from one rock to another. They were chasing it, climbing, slipping, falling on the ice, climbing and climbing and climbing, 1 hour, 2 hours, until they got to the top of that mountain. And when they got to the top of the mountain, they looked around and they could see the paw prints of the polar bear going down the other side to another mountain. And they turned around. They looked where they had come. And they could see the forest below. They could see the lake spreading for miles away in the distance. But they could also see the Orion. They could see a smoke and no smoke. And each one of them remembered their mother's throat. And then they looked at one another and said, "You have the copper cup. Who's got the copper cup? Who had it last?" They remembered throwing it to one another at some point in the chase. Nobody could remember. So they started to go down the mountain, beginning to make up lies in their head as to what had happened. And when they got back to the Uranga, when they got back to the skin, it was just flapping there. And they pushed it open. And they looked inside. And there was their mother. Not in bed anymore. She was standing in the ashes of the fire. And there was no word for them from her. She just stared at them. And when they looked at her feet, covered in ash, they could see that the feet had changed. And they were claws. And they didn't know why. And then slowly, she reached down and she picked up a grey cloak and she put it around her neck. And as she tied it, it became feathered, as if she was feathered. And she had a work basket in front of her, and she reached down, still watching her children. She took out a leather thimble, and she put it on her nose, and it became a great beak. And they still looked at her as she raised her arms, and as she raised her arms, they became feathered wings. As she stepped out of the ashes towards them, this mother of theirs. And as she got to the door, they were so scared of her by now that they stepped into the snow. And she came out and she looked at them. And then whoosh, up she went into the sky and began flying away. They said, "Mother, mother, please, what are you doing? Come back, we're sorry." But she didn't listen. Just flew around the edge of the lake. They started running after her as fast as they could go. 1 hour, 2 hours. They could see the sun chasing itself across the sky. They were running the other way, chasing her, calling her. She didn't say a word. But eventually the sun disappeared behind them. It grew dark, and there the moon came up, and they could see her shape, still flying. So they still chased after her. All that night they didn't stop, and the next day they were running again, and she was flying, and the next day, and the next night, and the next day, and the next night, for 14 days. And at 14 days, a boy, the youngest of the sons, he sat down in the deep snow, and he said to his sisters and his brothers, "Look at my feet." And they'd been running for so long, so hard, so persistently, that the soles of his shoes had worn away. His feet were bleeding, and he'd left, like his brothers and sisters, trails of their own blood in the snow that was growing into red moss. But she was still flying away. So they chased her again, calling and calling and calling, till their throats were raw. 14 more days, 14 more nights, 28 days. The cycle of the moon. It was at that point that the mother stopped flying. She just hovered in the sky above them. And then slowly she came down towards the children until she was hovering at head height. And she stared at these children that she loved so much. And she said this: "Too late. You're too late. Cuckoo. Cuckoo." She was gone. And they stared at one another. They didn't know what to do. And then they saw the red moss, and they knew that was the way home. So they followed it until they got to the Uranga. And then they knew by then what to do. And they went to her bed and they took out the sticks that were dry, and they built the fire that you built. And then they went down to the lake and they broke the ice and caught the fish. And they brought it in, they skinned it and hung it above the fire. And then they sat down with the door open, holding up a skin, and they waited for her to come back. But she never came back. She never came back. And she was the first cuckoo, as they say. And now the cuckoo comes here, to this land. It has a hollow in its back. And it'll look to watch birds building a nest. It'll mate, and then it'll wait. And when the mother and the father bird have built the nest, she'll go into the nest, and if there's an egg in there, she'll scoop it on the hollow of her back, and she'll throw it out. And then the cuckoo lays her egg, and flies away, and wants nothing to do with her children, ever again. Never done. That's why. So the next time your mother or your father asks you to do something, and of course every one of you must have one of these, I'm sure. Why not? How many of you have seen one of these? Any one of you ever seen one of these? What is the world coming to? 23 years ago I met the who was a man. Oh, you have?
I think it's in shop.
You saw one in the shop? I've got two of them. I might even let one or two of you have a go. So the mouth harp, your harp. 23 years ago, underneath the big oak tree in Norfolk, I met somebody called the grandfather of storytelling. And he said to me, stories are so important. He was a Scottish traveller. By the time he was your age, and younger, how old are you?
I'm 11.
So when he was 7, he could entertain all of you with stories all day long. He had 2,000 stories in his head. He grew up in a tradition of listening and telling stories. And by the time I finish, I'll probably ask you some questions as to why or what has gone on in your head for the past hour or so. But he taught me about the mouth harp. He pulled it out in a thunderstorm and said, this is such a thing. Been around for a couple of thousand years. You can get them in Asia, you can get them in Africa. Some are made of metal, some are bamboo. And all you do is put your lips over your teeth and you put it in your mouth, and your mouth becomes part of the instrument. So if you don't do anything else, you get that sound. But if you squeeze your mouth together, you get that sound. If you suck, are you familiar with one of these?
No, I'm not.
Oh,
No.
so
I will be.
I think you're amazing. So if you blow, great around the fire. If you click your tongue, really, really simple. If you put your thumb onto the one bit which is called the tongue, just a bit of metal just there, you flatten the sound. So really, really simple. They're about £3. That's all. You're on the move. And if you have one of these too, you have a bit of rhythm. So mouth harp, cheese harp, jaw harp. You can get them on the internet, but I recommend that you go to a music shop and try one out. Okay? And a bit later, if somebody wants to have a go on one, I'll let you have a go.